Some Criticisms of Marxism, Part 5. Basic Statistics Disprove Marxism's Core Theses. With Marxism's ideas around the labor theory of value and the exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, Marxism predicted that as time went on, the capitalist mode of production would become unstable and ultimately counterproductive. Marxism predicted a bleak and dystopian future should capitalism be allowed to continue. According to Marxism, wealth would continue to be channeled into fewer and fewer hands. Smaller businesses would be subsumed into larger businesses. The hyper-rich bourgeoisie would cement their wealth by creating monopolies that would place entire sectors of the economy into the hands of the few. The bourgeoisie would exert direct control over the governments of the world, leveraging this power with their vast wealth. While this class of bourgeoisie, this top 1%, sat high on the hog, the vast majority of the population would be mired in poverty. The proletariat would be herded into massive slums, where refuse and pollution would lessen their lifespans. Furthermore, given no other choice, the proletariat would have to bend and scrape in the factories and businesses of the monopolists. The bourgeoisie would only give the proletariat scraps of the true value of their products, only enough to keep the proletariat from starving en masse, and nothing more. Working 12 to 16-hour days, the proletariat, increasingly alienated from the world around them, would have hardly any time to rest, let alone pursue their own interests. The proletariat would lose their senses of self and identity as they were used as cogs in the machine. The potential of their minds would be squandered by the low-skill work foisted upon them. The teeming masses skittering about their hovels would seem to be but ants when seen from the ivory towers of the bourgeoisie. All the while, capitalism's proclivity towards crisis would result in increasing and ever more drastic economic depressions, which would drive the proletariat into ever-darkening pits of poverty. The bourgeoisie, ever jealous of their dragon's hoard of treasure, would invariably attempt to limit innovation and competition, ultimately miring society in stagnation. The prices of consumer goods, controlled by the iron fists of the monopolists, would increase wildly for the sake of capitalist profits. At a given point, the proletariat would find all their meager wages ending back in the pockets of the bourgeoisie, if they were able to afford the goods at all. In short, Marxism's vision of capitalism's future was a world where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. While this dystopian image of capitalism may seem to many observers to be accurate, it is largely a myth. Marxism was wildly incorrect. It is not the case that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, nor is it the case that capitalism invariably becomes counterproductive. One can demonstrate both of these points utilizing often overlooked statistical information. As various countries industrialized, those nations became increasingly wealthier. By almost any measure, in 1800, the United States would have been considered to be a third world country, 94% of the population living in rural areas. By 1920, the United States was an industrial powerhouse, over half the population living in the cities. Ever since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been the wealthiest nation to have ever existed in human history. At the end of 2019, the GDP of the United States was $21.730 billion. While the United States witnessed the most rapid growth every other nation that engaged in the Industrial Revolution likewise grew rapidly. The following graph shows the growth of the economies of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Spain throughout the 19th century, the time period when the principal works of Marxism were written. Of course, an argument could be made that merely looking at figures of GDP do not necessarily denote how well an economy is performing, let alone how well the average person is doing within that economy. The following graph charts the GDP per capita for the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Spain in the 19th century. Some may make the argument that these graphs are not necessarily useful in disproving Marxism because industrialization invariably increases economic growth merely through the productive forces unleashed by machinery. In many ways, this is true. However, mere industrialization is not enough as an explanatory factor for the rapid economic growth of Western capitalist nations. Communist nations like the Soviet Union certainly grew quickly as they industrialized. However, despite their vast wealth of natural resources, the USSR was always an economic pygmy when compared to the United States. This can be seen in the following graph, which compares the GDPs of the United States and the USSR throughout the 20th century. According to the CIA, between 1960 and 1983, the Soviet economy was always between 50 and 60% of the U.S. GDP. Yet another graph demonstrates how the U.S. far surpassed the Soviet Union in terms of GDP per capita. Furthermore, the Soviet economy always lagged behind its European competitors, as demonstrated by this graph. Not only did the Soviet economy lag behind European economies, it likewise lagged behind the economies of several developing nations. This graph clearly demonstrates that the growth of the Soviet economy was eclipsed by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Portugal, and Spain. What these statistics show is something that has been corroborated by economists around the world and across time. Namely, that as markets become more free, they likewise become more productive. This trend can be seen in the People's Republic of China. While still a communist dictatorship and a totalitarian nightmare, nevertheless, their economy boomed in direct proportion as they liberalized their economy. This can be seen in the following graph. These examples should do much to demonstrate that mere industrialization is not the only factor in rapid or sustained economic growth, nor is it the only factor that contributes to the improved living standards of the average consumer. Rather, such industrialization needs to be paired with relatively free markets in order to achieve such results. Indeed, such economic performance is very often directly correlated with economic freedom. This should demonstrate that capitalism, far from being counterproductive, is actually massively productive, arguably the most productive economic system in human history. It could be said, however, that the measure of GDP per capita itself is not necessarily a useful measure because all that it does is divide the GDP by the population. It does not necessarily reflect how the average person is actually performing. The data suggests that throughout the 19th century and the 20th and the 21st, wages for the average person has been steadily rising. The following graph charts changes in the costs of unskilled labor in the United States throughout the 19th century. Another way of saying costs of unskilled labor would be wages of unskilled labor. While there are certainly variations year to year, often corresponding to economic recessions, the overall trend is an upward one. The same phenomenon was occurring in the United Kingdom. These graphs demonstrate clearly that throughout the 19th century, far from the earnings of the proletariat declining, they were consistently increasing. In conjunction with rising wages, there was likewise a corresponding lowering in consumer prices. The following graph charts the consumer price index for the United States in the 19th century. The lower the figure, the lower the prices paid by average Americans for the goods they needed and desired. The spikes in consumer prices correspond directly to the War of 1812 and the American Civil War, times wherein government spending and wartime needs or deprivations caused shortages. Despite these incidents, the overall trend is a downward one. Furthermore, as nations industrialized and engaged in free market exchanges, the number of hours worked per week declined precipitously over the course of 130 years. Similarly, The total number of hours worked each year likewise declined. While working hours declined, the number of vacation days increased over the same time period. It has been often argued that Western nations owe such trends in work time and vacation time to labor unions and government regulations. To some extent, this is true. However, they were not the ones that started the trend. Economist Thomas D. Lorenzo argues that these trends were largely due to free markets, not necessarily labor union agitation. While these economic trends were occurring, there were corresponding growth in population in all of these nations. Not only did the population grow, the average person likewise started to live far longer than their ancestors did. Throughout the 19th century, at the height of when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were writing the bulk of their work, life throughout the industrializing nations was improving drastically. The average person in these countries were being paid more, working less, and living longer. Not only that, but they also had greater access to better and newer products. The top 1% of earners are certainly gaining much from the system and have much more wealth than the bottom 99% of income earners. However, it must be noted that it is never the same people within these categories over time. There is not an ossified class structure in capitalist countries, especially in the United States. Over the course of 44 years, 12% of the American population found themselves in the top 1% for a year or longer. 39% of Americans were in the top 5% for a year or more. 56% of Americans were in the top 10% for a year. And 73% of Americans found themselves in the top 20% of income earners for a year or more. There is much social mobility in the United States and other capitalist societies. The vast majority of Americans will find themselves among the ranks of the top earners of the nation. Another aspect of this fact that is often overlooked is that it is not the same people in the top 1%, let alone the top 20%. As part of the churn of creative destruction of the free market, fortunes are won and lost. This largely contradicts the Marxist prediction that the same group of wealthy capitalists would increasingly monopolize the global economy. This trend of improvement was not just isolated to the industrializing West. They are global trends. Absolute poverty is defined as someone living on $1.90 per day or less. In 1800, nearly 90% of the global population was living in absolute poverty. As of this writing, only 10% of the global population is living in absolute poverty, and the world is on track to eliminate absolute poverty by 2030. The greatest reductions of global poverty have occurred in the last 30 years. This trend is largely thanks to free market capitalism. It is true that the rich get richer, yet it is completely inaccurate to say that the poor get poorer under capitalism. Both the rich and the poor get richer over time. This fact flies directly in the face of Marxist analysis and does much to disprove one of the central tenets of Marxist theory.